Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am honored to follow my friend, the senior senator from Illinois. I enjoyed his comments very much. As you know, Mr. President, this Congress has passed, I think, 4 bills to provide money to the American people, to the American health care delivery system, and to businesswomen and businessmen throughout our country to fight the coronavirus and the damage that it has done to our public health and also to our economy. We have spent and will spend, because all of the money is not yet spent, about $3 trillion. That's 3 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 dollars. That is $3,000 billion. We don't even take in that much money in a year. We take in revenue about 90% of that. So we borrowed the money. I voted for the bills. We had to do it. The Federal Reserve, through its lending facilities, including but not limited to its 13(3) lending facilities, will probably spend at least another $3 trillion. I asked one of the senior officials at the Federal Reserve yesterday, and he told me that in the past 2 months, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has doubled. Now, many of the transactions confected by the Federal Reserve, of course, are loans. But we know that all the loans aren't going to be paid back, and since the Federal Reserve can't lose money, we're going to have to appropriate probably even more money than we appropriated in the CARES Act to backstop those losses. So we're up to $6 trillion, let's say. Speaker Pelosi, as you know, Mr. President, has introduced a new bill that would spend another $3 trillion. That, of course, we will have to borrow. Some Americans think we just print the money. We don't. We issue Treasury securities, which is just basically a bond. We borrow the money from people, from many Americans, many foreigners, including but not limited to China, and we have to pay that money back. So now we're up to $9 trillion. That's 9 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0. And our total debt that's going to put us at about $28 trillion. I'm not going to repeat the zeros again. I think I've made my point. Now, Speaker Pelosi's bill is not going to pass the United States Senate in its present form. You don't have to be a senior at the University of Georgia, Mr. President, to know that. It has provisions in it. For one thing, it costs $3 trillion, as I just pointed out. For another thing, it will expand the Affordable Care Act, which, of course, is controversial in the Senate. It will change our election laws dramatically. Some have suggested that Speaker Pelosi's bill will basically federalize elections, take them away from our states, which is certainly not contemplated and I think is forbidden by the United States Constitution. Speaker Pelosi's bill will dramatically change our immigration laws. It will provide amnesty for people who are in our country illegally during the coronavirus pandemic. will provide a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars to people who are in our country illegally. Some will like that, some won't like that, but the point I'm trying to make is it will be controversial. Speaker Pelosi's bill will release many of our federal prisoners during the coronavirus unless the Bureau of Prisons can affirmatively show that those prisoners are not going to go out and commit a violent crime. So in other words, the Bureau of Prisons has to prove that John Doe, the prisoner who's being released, is not going to go out and commit a violent crime. That's an impossible standard, of course, to meet. Speaker Pelosi's bill is very pro-cannabis. I don't know how you feel, Mr. President, about cannabis. That's your business. But it is controversial in the United States Senate. I think it mentions cannabis something like 28 times. And finally, Speaker Pelosi's bill addresses, in many respects, the subject of race. For example, it directs every federal agency to keep deposits in minority-owned banks. I'm not suggesting that that's good or bad. I'm just suggesting to you it will be very controversial, and for that reason, the bill is not going to pass this body in its present form. Now, that sets up, Mr. President, three scenarios. One scenario is that Speaker Pelosi, of course, she knows her bill isn't going to pass, and she doesn't intend for it to pass. It is what we call a messaging bill. She is sending a message on behalf of her party with an eye toward the November elections. It's done around here all the time. So one scenario is it's just a messaging bill and it's political pageantry. There's a second possibility that this is her opening bid, and that the leadership in the Senate on the Democratic side and the leadership in the Senate on the Republican side and the Republican leadership in the House and Speaker Pelosi and probably Treasury Secretary Mnuchin will then sit down and negotiate without much input, quite frankly, from members of the Senate. I don't know how it works in the House. And they will sit down and come up with something, and then they will come back to us. I'm in labor, not management, as you know, Mr. President. They will come back to us and say, here it is, take it or leave it, without much input from us individually. That's happened before. It's happened a lot before. And then we've got a choice. We can either say, geez, we weren't part of this process, or we can say, we can moan and groan and grumble and then just follow our leaders into the chute. We can moo and follow our leaders into the chute like cattle and vote for it. The third scenario, Mr. President, with respect to the Speaker's bill, would be that the second scenario happens, but the members of the Senate and the members of the House bow up and say, not this time. We're not going to moo and follow our leadership into the chute like cattle. We don't agree with what they did. That's a particular danger in the House. Because, again, you don't have to be in Mensa to understand that Speaker Pelosi has drafted a bill to address the interests and concerns of the left wing of her party in the House. So I can see a third scenario where the powers that be negotiate what they see as a compromise, and that compromise is taken back to the House, and the liberal members of the House, I don't use liberal and conservative in a pejorative sense, the liberal members of the House say, the short answer is no, the long answer is hell no, we're not voting for this. And that could also happen in the Senate, on my side of the aisle. Our leaders could negotiate a package and come back and say, okay, here's the deal. The liability provision is going to cost you $1 trillion in extra spending. And I can see some Republicans, one of them is standing right over here. I don't speak for him, but he's my good friend from Florida who's going to have some heartburn if that happens. and then nothing happens. We have appropriated, as I mentioned, I don't want to belabor the point, $3 trillion, another three if you add the Federal Reserve. Some of that money went to states and local governments, $150 billion. My state got about $3 billion. Many of the states need that money, Mr. President. I'm not saying that we aren't going to have to share sacrifice here. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask our state and local governments to submit to us revenue estimates. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask them to pare down their budgets. We ought to pare down ours as well. But to me, it's undeniable that states and local governments have sustained damage from the coronavirus. For God's sakes, their economies have been shut down. And if you're a state that relies on sales tax, nobody's been buying anything, or at least not like they did before. If you're a state that relies on income tax hadn't been coming in because nobody's been open. Now, some of my colleagues believe that we should not give the states any latitude to use any of that $150 billion to address revenue shortfalls. And I understand that point of view. I do. You take Florida, for example. In a few moments, Senator Scott is going to speak. He was a governor of Florida for 8 years, did an incredible job, balanced their budget, grew employment dramatically. And I can understand, not speaking for my good friend the senator, but I can understand how someone in the Senate would say, well, no, every governor needs to go reform his entire state government. But that's not going to happen, at least not within the next year. In the meantime, I believe that state and local governments have sustained damage, and I think that is just a natural fact. They have. I have a bill, as you know, Mr. President, Senate Bill 3608. It is called the Coronavirus Relief Fund Flexibility for State and Local Government Act. Senator Sullivan has another bill that does somewhat the same thing as mine. I think Senator Rounds has a bill. But all my bill would do is this. That $150 billion we've already spent, which now has been given to the states and local governments, says it can only be used for coronavirus expenses. My bill would change that. My bill would not spend a single solitary new dollar. Let me say that again. My bill will not add to our spending. It just says the governors have additional flexibility to spend the $150 billion that we've already given them. They can't spend it to bail out their pension systems. My bill prohibits that. They can spend it to address a revenue shortfall, which many of them have. We will never agree in this body about which state is well managed and which state is not well managed. One person's trash is another person's treasure. And I have personal feelings. Senator Scott does. I see my good friend Senator Warner. He is here. He was a very distinguished governor of Virginia. He'll have probably a different point of view. There's one thing we can't agree on. There's real danger that Speaker Pelosi's bill is not going to pass. It's not going to pass today, and it may not pass tomorrow, and it may not pass in June. The second thing we can agree on is that our states and our cities have sustained damage. And we can take off the handcuffs and allow the money we have already given them to try to help them repair that damage as we recover from this horrible pandemic. And for that reason, Mr. President, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent, not that we pass my bill. I'm going to ask and a second for unanimous consent, that we just vote on my bill. We don't vote enough around here. You know, I came up here to deliberate and decide. I didn't come up here to issue press releases and participate in delay and stultification. No, I want to do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Instead, we want an honest week's work or an honest week's pay for an honest day's pay. We want an honest week's pay for an honest day's work. All I want to do is have a vote on my bill. If you don't like it, you can chew it up, spit it out, and step on it, and vote no in front of God and country. But if you like it, you can vote for it, and let's be senators again. And for that reason, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, the Committee on Appropriations be discharged from further consideration of S 3608, that's my bill, Mr. President, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that there be 2 hours of debate. See, we'll have plenty of debate. Equally divided between the proponents and the opponents of the bill, and that upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Kennedy Substitute Amendment number 1581 be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended with a 60 affirmative vote threshold for passage with no intervening action or debate. Finally, if passed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. Let my people vote.